Thank you all for coming. I'm really pleasantly surprised at this big crowd. 2 weeks back when Gail mentioned to me that we're going to have to move rooms from the 60-person amphitheater to a 100-person room, I kind of patted myself on the back and I went home that evening and looked at myself in the mirror and said, Raj, you're really popular, you know? And then last week I met Gail here and she told me that, Raj, in case you think that you're really popular, that's not the reason why so many people have signed up. It's because a lot of people are really miserable. And they want to know what the secret to happiness is. So thank you very much, all you miserable people, for showing up. Really appreciate it. If I ask people to rank different goals, and these are all goals that are very important because I've done focus groups with people in interviews and found out what goals are very important. Things like maintaining healthy relationships, being physically healthy, having a successful career, and so on, making a lot of money. Happiness always emerges as one of the top goals, okay? In one of these studies, surveys we did, it came kind of second to, but statistically non-significantly different from maintaining healthy relationships or good family life. So as I mentioned right at the bottom of that screen, there's studies which have been done with 10,000 people surveys. Okay, happiness emerges as the most important goal. But yet, it turns out, and most of you took the Gini survey, right? Is there anybody who did not take the survey that was sent out? Okay, some of you did not. Okay, so I sent out a survey through Gail to you guys, and one of the questions on the survey was what I call the Genie question. And the Genie question goes like this, right? You know Aladdin's genie. Let's say that the genie approaches you or appears in front of you and gives you 3 wishes, grants you 3 wishes. What 3 wishes would you make? If happiness is in fact a very, very important goal, you would think that, of course, people should wish for happiness. Why not, right? I mean, the genie is giving you everything and anything. It's all powerful, all knowing, okay? And in some of these surveys, they also add that it's benign. Assume that the genie is benign, right? Turns out a lot of people don't think that it's benign, as you'll see in a little bit. But it turns out most people do not ask for happiness. Instead, in surveys that I've done outside of the school, outside of this audience, material things like money, a big house, a great swimming pool, a beautiful car, vacationing in exotic places, etc., is by far the most popular wish that people make. I would like even more money. And it's consistent with a lot of surveys that have been done in which people are asked, what's the one thing that could make you happier? People say money. 60% of the people say money. In this crowd, you guys are all more, I guess, advanced or evolved or whatever, right? Not so many people ask for money. In fact, a lot of you, I was kind of pleasantly surprised to see that personal growth emerged as being one of the second most desired kind of wish out there. And world peace, right? I mean, really evolved crowd. But in the real world out there, it turns out that world peace is very low. But what is kind of surprising is happiness ranks so low, right? Even with this crowd, and you all knew that the topic was happiness today, and therefore there's a little bit of self-selection going on, right? Maybe even a little bit of priming, right? I mean, you guys have already been alerted to the idea that maybe I can ask for happiness. But it clearly is not one of the top goals, right? Top wishes. Why is it? Okay, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between what people say is important and what is revealed in terms of their wishes. And this is related to the fundamental happiness paradox, and I'm going to talk about it, like I said, towards the end of this talk. Let me just first point this out, that asking the genie for happiness is a smart thing. Okay, if you truly want to be happy, a lot of research has shown that you need to have clarity on what your goal is if you are to achieve that goal. It makes sense, right? Which is why a lot of times these sports psychologists ask athletes to visualize what it is that they want. If you don't know where you're going, how are you going to get there, right? So it's very intuitive. But having just that clarity alone is not enough. It's also very important to be willing to make trade-offs that give that goal a higher priority, right? So if it comes choosing between, let's say, happiness and your ego or happiness and money, you're better off making trade-offs that enhance your chances of achieving your goal of happiness. Okay, so it makes sense. So, athletes know that if they want to win an Olympic medal, they're going to have to make trade-offs, wake up at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning and exercise, eat healthily, not party too much, and so on. Students know what it takes to earn grades, and they're willing to make those trade-offs if they want those high grades, etc. Why should happiness be any different, right? But it turns out with happiness, somehow, we all think that we can just lead life business as usual, and somehow, magically, happiness is going to fall into our lap. Okay, so getting back to the Genie question. So I didn't leave it at that. Surveyed maybe close to 1,000 people now with the Genie question. And I've interviewed maybe about 100 people, maybe 200 actually, across the 4 classes that I've taught, and some other people outside of it. Why don't you ask the Genie for happiness, right? You say happiness is very important. Yes, people agree. Why don't you ask the genie for happiness? Okay? There are 12 different reasons, and you probably can't read all of them from where you're sitting, but don't fret. I'm going to get through each of these reasons one at a time. So the first reason is, some of the people think that happiness does not come to those who chase it, right? So I don't want to ask for happiness because once I get desperate for happiness, then it won't come to me, you know? So it's similar to a butterfly, kind of chasing a butterfly. The butterfly doesn't come to you. There's even a quote like that by somebody. You know, happiness is like a butterfly. It kind of chooses to sit on you, but you can't really chase it. Okay, and it's partly true. It turns out that there have been studies that have been done where people have been asked explicitly to try and maximize happiness as they're listening to songs, okay? And those who were asked to maximize happiness ended up being less happy than those who were just told to listen to songs, okay? Why is it? So what happens when you make happiness an explicit goal and you chase it? You tend to monitor where you are to where you want to be, okay? Turns out that for every goal that we adopt, a monitoring system kind of automatically kicks in. And one of the cutest examples of this is if I ask you to not think of a white bear, right? If I ask you to not think of a white bear, you know, whatever you think of, don't think of a white bear. It turns out we find it very difficult to not think of a white bear, right? Why? Because our goal is to not think of a white bear. And how do we know if you're achieving that goal? By monitoring where we are compared to where we want to be. And where we want to be is not to think of a white bear. And the only way we'll know we're there of not thinking of a white bear is by thinking of the white bear first, so that we can't think of it, et cetera, okay? So with happiness, what happens is it's a byproduct of this discrepancy between where you are and where you want to be. If you have a goal and you achieve it, then you feel happy. If you're far away from it, far from achieving it, then you're unhappy. And if happiness itself is the goal, and usually we set up a high level of happiness in order to feel that we are where we want to be, then by definition, you're not going to be as happy as you want to be, okay? And that is then going to erode into your happiness, okay? But this is important, I think. It might seem like a subtle difference. To me, it's not very subtle. There's an important difference between chasing something and being desperate for it, being feverish, and making it a priority, okay? There's many other goals like happiness that when you chase them, it turns out you don't achieve them, like sleep, right? Trying to desperately fall asleep, again, I mean, you're monitoring where you are to where you want to be, and where you want to be is asleep. And when you're asleep, you can't monitor anymore, right? The fact that you're monitoring means that you're not asleep, and then you get desperate to sleep and so on, right? So it becomes a kind of a vicious cycle. Wooing somebody that you're really interested in, right? So my wife is here, so I know this from personal experience, that, you know, trying to desperately chase her was not productive. So I had to kind of ease off a little bit. Health, right? I mean, worrying too much about being healthy, being a hypochondriac, is not conducive to being healthy. But at the same time, you can do things, put things in place in your life so that you make it more likely that you achieve that goal. So taking a warm bath, or not eating a heavy meal, making sure you don't look at the emails after 9 p.m., etc., are good things you can do in order to fall asleep, right? So prioritizing is different from chasing something. Okay, reasons 2 and 3, they kind of go together. People think that happiness is too abstract. You know, what exactly would I get in return if I asked the genie for happiness? You know, I'm not even sure. Would I be peaceful? Would I be ecstatic? Would I be in love? You know, and turns out the dictionary definition doesn't help. You know, it's very loose. It's an umbrella term that people use to fit in any positive emotion that they want, okay? And a related idea is that happiness is too shallow. People think that if I ask the genie for happiness, I'm going to end up like this kind of drugged out guy saying, hey, make peace, not war, you know, or something like that. You know, one of those Berkeley kind of people. A lot of people are afraid of turning into somebody like that. You know, they want to be kind of in control and normal and doing things that make them look normal to other people and so on. And they're afraid that that might not be the case if they ask for happiness, okay? But again here, the interesting thing is, even though people find it difficult to come up with a definition of happiness that's concrete and not very shallow, if you in fact ask people, as I've done, to tell me about an event that happened in their life that made them happy, okay? And I content analyze what it is that they say, it turns out that people do have pretty specific and concrete definitions of happiness. And not just that, some of these definitions are not at all shallow. Okay, I'm going to share with you a couple of definitions that have turned out. Okay, so happiness with a small h, I call it with a small h. This is an example of a very concrete emotion that's not very deep. That's in fact somewhat shallow, okay? So this is the positivity that results from a lot of achievements. It's a sense of pride, feeling a sense of superiority over other people. So there's two kinds of pride that can happen. Interpersonal pride, you feel you're better than other people, superior to other people. And intrapersonal pride, you've come a long way from where you were before, okay? And interpersonal pride, I think, is a little more shallow. And I don't mean this in a sense that it's emotion that is cheap or whatever. I just mean it in the sense that it's not sustainable. In that sense, it's shallow. And I'll tell you why it's not sustainable in a little bit. It's a feeling that I'm special, singled out, gifted. To a lot of people doing research in emotions, this is very similar to or identical to pride, actually. Then there's another kind of happiness, the happiness of the big H, which results from sensing that you're undivided, unfragmented, in harmony. So in other words, life as it is perfect with its imperfections. Among the respondents, the older respondents tend to be the ones who come up with the second definition, okay? A lot of the younger people are not familiar with this happiness of the big H, although when I talk to them about it, they seem like to kind of be able to relate it to some extent. So they've had some experience with it, but not a lot, okay? Then there's a bunch of people who come up with love, what I would call love. So the idea is that they say that they experienced it when they went home for Thanksgiving, or they acquired a new boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever, you know, or a new pet, etc. Okay, and these are very specific, right? I mean, these are not at all abstract. They're concrete. And some of them, love and what is called elevation or fulfillment, are in fact also quite deep. Okay, they're not shallow. So why not ask for these kinds of happiness from the genie, right? If you think that asking for happiness is shallow. Let me go to reason number 4, which is that happiness is fleeting and ephemeral. So if I ask for it, then it won't last. So why ask for something that I know cannot last forever by definition? And the idea is that, and it seems pretty intuitive, that happiness or emotions are kind of like night and day. You know, you need the night, you need a lack of light, you need darkness in order to appreciate light, right? You need to know what is small in order to know what's big, right? How many of you guys subscribe to this idea that happiness ought to be fleeting because you can't experience happiness without experiencing sadness? And I think that it's possible that in reality, it's going to be very difficult to sustain a state of positivity forever, okay? But I think that it is possible, theoretically possible, and subscribing to the idea that you can't have one without the other, in fact, undermines your ability to be able to sustain happiness. Okay, let me just give you a few examples by way of convincing you. First of all, kids can be happy for long, right? If it's true that you need sadness in order to be happy, how come kids can be happy for such a long time? There's been studies done with kids, and it turns out that they go through 4 states, okay? Sleeping, eating, exploring the environment, okay, and pooping. Okay, pooping I just add as a 4th one, okay? It's not really, it doesn't take a long time. But anyway, so it turns out across those activities, kids go through either energy acquisition or energy expenditure, okay? So when they're eating, when they're sleeping, etc., they're either replenishing energy or they're maintaining it. And the process of replenishing and maintaining energy is correlated with an emotional state of peace or calmness. And expending energy is associated with a sense of exuberance and stimulation. So theoretically, it's possible if kids get everything that they want at every moment in time, then they'll oscillate or go through transitions between high arousal energy states, or stimulating energy states, and low arousal energy states, but they don't have to venture into the negative territory ever, okay? And it's true that for a lot of kids who are well taken care of, who are well nurtured, who get everything that they need at that point in time, it turns out that they can actually go through long periods of time when they're happy. And it turns out, in fact, when surveys done with people across the world, with over 40,000 people, there's a researcher out here called Sam Gosling who's done some of this work. The happiest moments in our lives are when we are around 8 years old, okay? Before that, I think it's difficult to kind of elicit responses from kids because they don't know what happiness is, or before they can, you know, answer the question, they've run away or something, okay? But we start out being really happy when you're about 8 years old, and we're really miserable when you're around 15, 16 years old, right around when puberty hits, right? Especially women, it turns out. Okay, and after that, we kind of like crawl our way up, okay, a little bit, and then a midlife crisis hits right around 46, okay, which is where I am, which is why I'm so miserable, okay? And then you go back to being happier as you're older. When you hit Vijay's age, then you're really happy, okay, which is why he's so happy out there. And part of the reason why that happens is at that point, you're no longer willing to put up with bullshit, right? You're saying, okay, I know what makes me happy. I don't want to hang out with people that make me unhappy. I don't want negative forces in my life. I'm going to gravitate towards positive things. You have the clarity, okay? So you go back to being a child in a sense, okay? But the point is that you can, in fact, sustain long periods of happiness, okay? And it's not true that you need one in order to experience the other. You would have to oscillate between high arousal or high energy positive states and low energy positive states, but you don't have to venture that much into the negative territory, okay? Can I ask you this question, which to a lot of people convinces them to some extent that happiness, in fact, can last long, by asking you the reverse question: can depression last forever, right? And it turns out a lot of people think, yeah, I know somebody like that, who's always depressed, right? If depression can last forever, then why can't happiness, right? It's just the opposite. Happiness with the small h, by definition, is going to be fleeting because your happiness depends on external stimuli, on external circumstances. It depends on how much you've achieved or how much other people think you've achieved. It depends on your wealth. It depends on relative comparisons to other people, which is always going to fluctuate and be in a flux. Okay, there's always going to be somebody who's going to come up who's superior to you at some point, physically, intellectually, beauty-wise, etc. So if you tether your happiness to comparisons to other people, then you're setting yourself up for this kind of volatile roller coaster ride, okay? But if it's an internal state, it depends on your attitude, you're comfortable with whatever it is that's around you, and you take it as things that make life interesting, as a challenge. Life is perfect with its imperfections. I'm completely taken care of. Now, it's difficult to adopt that attitude, and there's some obstacles to adopting that attitude, but if you can even relate to it a little bit, then you understand that that's a much more sustainable state to be in. It's similar to how we don't adapt to good views or to friendships. In fact, they get better with time, a lot of time. So happiness with a big H is like that. Okay, reason number 5, this is related to the idea that happiness is shallow, but in a relative sense, a lot of people think that other goals like pursuit of truth, with a capital T, I want to know what reality is there a God, etc. That's much more important to me. Being one with God, a lot of religious people feel that that's much more important. So I have a kind of a 2-part response to this. Can any goal really be much more important or more important than happiness? Okay. So in other words, from a purely philosophical or logical standpoint, is there any act that is quote unquote selfless, right? So think about a mom that jumps into a burning building to retrieve a child. She's doing it, you could argue, because she would rather do it and risk her life than live with the knowledge that she never attempted to save her child. So she's happier doing it and risking her life than not risking her life. So even this quote-unquote purely selfless altruistic act, in a sense, can be logically thought of as being not so selfless. It is, you're trying to adhere to a certain value or a vision that you have of yourself. So in that sense, it is serving a purpose. It's making you happy in that sense, okay? But keeping logic aside, there's a bunch of studies that I want to talk about now really quickly that seem to show that happiness is in fact a very, very important goal for us, if not the most important goal. And everything else is subsumed under it. So in one set of studies, people were asked to recollect whatever they could about a very old past event, right? And it turns out that people remember how they felt about certain things, about products, about events, about people. They may have lost memory for the details of the event. So, very rarely will you say that, I really remember what Sarah was wearing and her color of her hair and everything, but I can't really kind of, remember how I felt about her. Right? In fact, it would mostly be the opposite, that you know exactly how you felt about people or about movies or about books or about places, you might forget the details, okay? The second, I think this is even more impressive, is that a colleague of mine at Columbia who interviewed a lot of people who were in their quote-unquote winter years, right? I mean, they were close to dying, 80 years or more, etc. And he asked them, if there's one thing that you would do to change your life, if you could relive your life, how would it be different, right? And many people said that I wouldn't change anything, right? I mean, that seems like one of the responses that a lot of people give because, they've come to a point where they understand, they went through a lot of ups and downs, they're at peace with it, right? They're at peace with their lives. But if there's one thing they would change, the most popular response was that I'd be less stuck up, I'd be less aggressive, and I'd be much more focused on having a good time and taking simple pleasures of life, okay? In other words, I'd lead a happier life. Okay, I wasn't as focused on what it is that ultimately truly mattered, which is to make people around me happy and be happy myself. Okay, I was too kind of caught up in the rat race. okay? Finally, this is one of my favorite set of studies that looked at Alzheimer patients. So Alzheimer's patients, some of you may know somebody who suffers from it personally. They have short-term memory loss, right? So you might visit them and 10 minutes later, they've forgotten that you visited them, right? You leave your car keys in their house, you go knocking on the door, and then they open the door and say, hey, when did you come, Raj, right? So, and you've just left their house, right? So it turns out that a lot of people feel very frustrated when they have to deal with Alzheimer's patients because, they feel that the time they spent with these people is a waste because they don't remember you, right? They don't remember that you visited, et cetera. So some of these Alzheimer's patients were put under the fMRI machine, which measures the brain activities, and certain parts of the brain light up when you're feeling happy. And it turns out that a full 3 hours after somebody that they like has visited them, the brain is still kind of firing, right? So they're still happy after 3 hours. Okay, so this is the excuse that my wife and I use to take our kids on holidays. We all know that, both of us know that they're not going to remember anything, right? But we think that we are kind of having a good impact on them by making their brains fire. So I think we're setting up a good platform for them to be good citizens, etc. Reason number 6. A lot of people feel that they would become selfish if the genie were to grant them happiness, okay? So the idea is that if I'm already happy, then why should I do anything for other people? Why should I care about other people? I'm already as happy as I want to be, right? So happiness is going to make me selfish. Okay, but in fact, it turns out the research on emotion shows that it's exactly the opposite, especially with this emotion that I talked about some time back that I called fulfillment, okay? Some people refer to as elevation as the term that's used. With elevation or fulfillment, it promotes altruism, okay? The idea is, it's almost like the analogy is to think of a bucket. So if your bucket is empty, if your emotional bucket is empty, you're feeling insecure or afraid or anxious or stressed, then you want other people to pour into the bucket, right? You want to take care of your own emotional needs first before you're willing to look to other people and serve them. But if your bucket is overflowing with joy, then it's almost natural for you to then look to other people and figure out ways in which you want to serve them, okay? And you can think back on your own life, right? When are you more likely to be playful with your kids? When you're stressed out, when people have been shouting at you at the office, or when things have been going well in your life, right? So it turns out that this intuition is wrong. In fact, the opposite is true, that you're more likely to be altruistic when you're feeling happy. So we get into some of the more, I think, interesting reasons here. I'm already as happy as I want to be, right? First of all, I think that if somebody is in that state, then they probably wouldn't be wishing for anything more, right? So you would probably say, I give away my wishes to other people because I'm already there, right? But the people who say this do make for some wishes, right? So they're not quite as happy as they want to be, it seems like, okay? But I want to mention here something that, if some of you are in this position, very happy for you. I think we need more people like you. It would be great to have a world in which everybody's happy. I think that would just boost up everybody's happiness to such an extent that we'd burst through the stratosphere of happiness and, reach the moon or whatever. But I do want to point out that it's possible that for some of us who claim this, there's a little bit of a delusion going on, okay? And we know that the human capacity for being deluded is infinite, almost, There's been so many studies on this, on cheating, for example. Everybody thinks everybody else cheats, but they don't themselves, etc. That there's a lot of delusion going on, okay? And the delusion with respect to happiness has some strategic element to it, which makes me feel that people either consciously or non-consciously might claim to be more happy than they actually are, okay? One of the things that's been found, for example, is that happy people attract other people, okay? Happy people are popular, right? Who would you rather go to? Somebody who's miserable or somebody who's happy? Everybody goes towards the happy people, right? They make other people happy, so everybody wants to be happy, and so you go towards people who are happy rather than towards people who are miserable. And to the extent that people recognize it, there is a strategic element, there's a value to be derived from proclaiming to be happy, okay? The second thing that can happen is when you say you're happy, when you tell yourself you're happy or tell other people you're happy, you do get a boost in happiness, okay? So there's this second kind of strategic element to it. So in that sense, it could also almost be a self-fulfilling prophecy. To claim you're happy is the same as being happy, okay? But it turns out it's not that simple either, right? In the sense that you can't lead a sustainedly happy life by just telling yourself you're happy, okay? You need to put things in place. You need to feel good from the inside for you to be happy in the long term. So to some extent, at the margin, it can help you be a little happier, right? Just before you make a presentation, you can kind of look at yourself in the mirror and say you're popular, and that might help you, but it won't help you in the long run, okay? The other thing I do want to mention here too is that those who think of yourself as being happy, maybe you haven't thought about these subtle differences in the kinds of happiness. Okay, which kind of happy are you? Okay, maybe what you're really saying is I'm content. I'm content with the material possessions I have. I don't need any more. There's lots of other poor people in this world, and I'd rather that all my, the extra wealth goes to them. But that's not the same as being happy with a big H. Okay, so in a sense, I mean, there's another place to aspire to be, which is better in many ways. It's more the feeling that can be sustained. It also results in selflessness. It results in greater creativity. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and has some other positive effects associated with it. Reason number 8. Okay, so I don't want to be happy all the time. I sometimes want to feel negative emotions. Okay, so therefore I want to ask the genie for happiness. Okay. Now it turns out, and these are informal surveys that I've done with a lot of people, is whenever they're happy, I approach them and say, "You're feeling really happy, aren't you?" And they say, "Yes, I am." So would you rather not feel happy right now? Because it kind of gets boring, right? I've never heard anybody say, no, I don't want any happiness anymore, okay? I've approached people who are feeling miserable, and I've asked them, is it okay for the misery to continue? I've never heard anybody say, it's okay. Everybody wants to be happier if they're feeling miserable. Nobody wants the emotion of happiness to end, okay? But when we're asked this question, we come up with this reason that, being happy all the time is boring, okay? Happiness is by definition the state you want to be in, okay? Happiness is the state you want to be in. Therefore, it can never get boring. Okay, there have been studies which have been done with rats. You guys probably know of some of these studies in the 50s and 60s. There was an electrode that went into the brain that stimulated part of the brain called the pleasure point that they could stimulate at will by just pressing on a lever, and that would make them feel happy. And these rats ended up starving themselves to death because they kept pressing the lever all the time. They forgot to have food, they forgot to have sleep, they forgot to have sex, okay, they just starved to death, okay? Now with human beings, I think we don't have that danger, I believe. Now the experiment hasn't been done with humans, but if it were to be done, I imagine that we wouldn't be that stupid because we can forecast. We have the ability to imagine futures, rats don't, okay? So we know that we're probably going to starve to death if we don't eat, okay? So we would definitely do that, but the point is that there is some evidence showing that happiness isn't a boring state, okay? It also turns out happiness will not reduce your creativity. There is this myth. So Paul here was asking me if I was going to mention Csikszentmihalyi. So there's a researcher called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi who's done a lot of work on flow and creativity. And what he finds is there is a myth of the suffering creative person, okay? And a lot of examples that stand out like Salvador Dali or Dostoevsky, people who led miserable lives that happen to be creative, I think, stand out as examples of how you need to be miserable in order to be creative, okay? But really, I mean, creativity is orthogonal to misery. If you look at a 2x2 kind of cell, 4-cell design, miserable, not miserable, creative, not creative, there's a lot of people who are neither miserable nor creative, okay? But there's people filling up all the other 3 cells as well. There's lots of people. In fact, in studies that have been done on remote associations test and so on, it turns out that when you're feeling calm, when you're feeling happy and peaceful is when you're likely to be creative, okay? Not when you're feeling miserable and stressed out, okay? So it's a myth. A constantly happy life is meaningless. A lot of people think that, and that kind of leads me to another reason that I want to talk about in a little bit as reason number 11. So let me just postpone that. Reason number 9, I don't deserve to be happy, okay? So a lot of people who mention this, I think, have a noble disposition. They're the kind of people who are content with everything that they have. I talked about it some time back. They're happy with the wealth that they have, the achievements that they have. They think that they're blessed, okay? But they also feel that a lot of other people are not, okay? People in Iraq and Afghanistan and India, they're all suffering. So people feel that, let the happiness go to them. I don't want happiness. I don't deserve to be happy. I have everything going for me. It's almost like I'm being too greedy by also asking for happiness, okay? What I think these people are saying, in fact, is that I have more of these extrinsic rewards, these kind of conventional yardsticks of success. And I don't want any more of those, okay? And if they were to think a little more deeply about this topic, I think they would come to the conclusion that it's not just that they deserve to be happy, I think they're obliged to be happy, okay? And that's very important to note. They don't just deserve to be happy, they're obliged to be happy, because if they weren't happy with everything that they have, who else could be happy, right? And if you especially note this fact that happiness leads to many positive effects, okay, you're less selfish. You're less selfish when you're happy. It's only when you're not happy that you become more selfish, okay? When you're happy, you're spreading your happiness to other people, you're being selfless. So for the sake of others, even if you think that you don't deserve to be happy, I think you ought to be happy, okay? And the people who belong to this category, who are at the peak of success, the top 2% of the world in terms of wealth and so on, we need to set the example to other people that life can be simpler, life can be more beautiful, life can be more cooperative, more harmonious, okay? We need to be the people who take it upon ourselves to tell the rest of the world to lead a happier life, okay? So I think I would urge you to get out of this, I don't deserve to be happy kind of a mindset. So happiness should be earned and not received. I want to be happy for the right reasons, okay? Now, the people who say this have the idea that fake happiness is not good. Now, I want real, authentic happiness, right? But they're okay with fake money, right? They're okay not really earning the money, you know, genie granting them money. They're even okay with fake relationships. You know, they don't really have to, I mean, they're okay with not working hard towards building a great relationship. The genie grants them, from now on, you get along fabulously well with your wife. Yeah, I'll take that, right? But somehow with happiness, they draw the line, right? Fake happiness, no, okay? So one of the experiments that's often kind of mentioned in this context is, there's a typo there, it should be Nozick. Nozick's thought experiment. It goes something like this, right? Imagine that your brain is hooked up to a computer, right? And the computer program kind of generates events that you now imagine, okay? And it's so good that it's actually like real life, right? So you can't really tell if it's real life or fake life. It's that good, okay? And when you connect it to this program, a fabulous set of events happen, right? You're successful and you have a beautiful house, a lovely wife or husband, great kids, and you get all kinds of awards, go on great vacations, eat great food. If you've seen The Matrix, right? It's kind of like that, okay? Now the question is, how many of you guys would be willing to get attached to this or plugged into this? And I asked this as one of the survey questions. I know that some of you guys didn't take it. Your responses, 70% said no. I don't want to be plugged into this machine. I'd rather experience authentic misery than fake happiness, right? Okay. Now, that experiment and the results from it have been taken to conclude that people want real happiness. They don't want fake happiness, okay? But I think there's more to the story. I think the thought experiment is flawed in some ways. One of the ways in which it is flawed is that people can't relate to how life would be if they were in fact plugged into the machine. And so it's very difficult for them to put themselves and empathize with the situation of being plugged into the machine. And so asking them to kind of indulge in this highly difficult task is very tough, okay? As a simple example, women who get pregnant and deliver a child, when they're delivering the child, it turns out that 70 to 80% say never again, right? Especially if they're not on epidurals, okay? They say never again, but after a few weeks or a few months pass, they're ready to have another child again, right? So you can't empathize with how you're feeling when you're undergoing a certain level of intense pain or pleasure, okay? It's called the cold to hot empathy gap, okay? Another example of the empathy gap is that I've sometimes endured. When I'm in the throes of a really bad hangover, I say, never drinking again, never, And it turns out that that's not true, right? Okay, so that's one of the problems with the thought experiment, okay? So I've done another thought experiment, what I call the anti-Nozick thought experiment, what I call anti, or ANTE, anti-Nozick thought experiment. Kavya here, who's sitting here, has helped me run some of those studies. So in that, that's the third question that you were asked, which is kind of the mirror image of the thought experiment, So imagine that the life you're experiencing right now is fake. You're, in fact, just a vegetable lying comatose on a hospital bed, and your brain is connected to a computer program, and life, in fact, is much more miserable than you think it is right now, okay? So you're far happier now, and this is all fake. Okay, would you rather be unplugged from the machine? Now, it turns out that many people say, no, this is fine as it is. Okay? So it's not so much, I think, that people are running away from fake and want truth. Okay? I think people are just afraid of new things, so they want status quo. And this looks like real to me, I mean, but that's how the Nozick machine would look like too, if you were plugged into it, right? And people kind of find it difficult to relate to all those, okay? So the point I'm trying to make here is the idea that asking for fake happiness is somehow not good and you need to be happy for the right reasons is not really a true reason why people don't ask the genie for happiness, okay? Reason number 11, asking the genie for happiness means handing over the keys of my life to the genie, right? Who knows what the genie might do to me, okay? So this is related to the idea of having control over your life, okay? And not wanting to have somebody else control your life. I'd rather be the author of my bad and stupid mistakes than somebody be responsible for my great decisions, okay? That kind of an idea. So it kind of taps into this desire for control that a lot of us have that is a very major internal obstacle to happiness, okay? And that's what the beauty of this genie question is to me, is that it reveals a lot of the internal obstacles that we impose on ourselves. Okay, now it turns out that on a lot of happiness research has found that giving up control is crucial for happiness. So the art of giving up is as important as the art of not giving up, okay? So knowing when to give up versus not is a very, very important skill. For example, the group of people called satisficers are much happier than the group of people called maximizers. Maximizers desire a lot of control over the environment. A really great example of a maximizer is my dad, We went to Cancun one time, for example, and he looked out of the beautiful view out there, and he was happy for 2 seconds, And then after that, he started looking at the shower and say, hey, there's a lot of mold out here, and we picked up the phone, it wasn't working, and he was really pissed off, and then started shouting at everybody. Okay. Satisficers, on the other hand, will go into a situation and think to themselves, I'm going to enjoy myself here. Okay. I'm going to enjoy myself, maximize my happiness under the constraint of what's available, rather than trying to make happiness even more by changing things around all the time. Now, I'm not recommending that we be satisficers all the time. I think it's important to be a maximizer sometimes, because maximizers are the ones who come up with inventions because they identify problems and ways in which things can be improved. But to be constantly stuck in the maximizer mindset is not good either, okay? You need to be able to straddle that, and there's an art to it, okay? Likewise, obsessive-compulsive people are less happy. Obsessive-compulsive people are wanting to be in control constantly, okay? Okay, so the final thing I want to mention here, it actually is very exciting new research that's coming out of neurobiology and evolutionary psychology. A lot of the brain stuff is finding that free will, in fact, might be an illusion, okay? So this might be one of those like mind-blowing kind of concepts that gets a lot of press in the near future. There's a guy called Benjamin Liebe who did a bunch of experiments in which he asked people to kind of move their thumb, okay? And he kind of had a dial, a kind of a clock in front of them, and the clock kind of moved around. There was a red kind of dot that moved around the clock. And he would ask them to indicate the point at which they made their decision to move the thumb, right? Now it turns out, let's say that the dot was at 1 when I decided, okay, I'm going to move my thumb now. It turns out that about 800 milliseconds before I knew that I'd made a decision, the experimenter could tell me I was going to make a decision, okay? So our subconscious is making a decision first before we are aware of it, okay? And you don't even have to look at these experimental evidence. If you just think back logically to all the decisions you make, right? And to what extent the I or the you had control over it. You'll realize that you didn't decide where you were born. You didn't decide the color of your skin. You didn't decide your parents. You didn't decide your neighborhood, your upbringing, your neighborhood, your friends. So a lot of the things that went in as input into who you are right now and the decisions you make were not in your control to begin with, right? And even the idea that you have free will is an idea that was put into your head. I can almost guarantee that had you been born in the Middle Ages in India, you would believe everything was destiny, okay? No one believed in free will at that point. Reason number 12, I can't be happy unless I have fill in the blanks. Okay, a variant of it is, I don't want to be happy unless I have X, Y, or Z, So one of the students with whom I had an exchange about this said, I don't want to ask the genie for happiness because the genie might turn me into a village idiot, right? I might be one of those guys, like, do you guys know this character called Leslie who died some time back in downtown Austin, right? He would kind of wear, dress in drag, and he was a male, but dressed as a woman. I might turn into that kind of a guy. Maybe he was very happy. I didn't know him personally, but let's assume that he was happy. Would you be him, rather be him, or be you? The real me, miserable me, or the fake Leslie happy, right? Most people say, no, I don't want to do that because then I would lose, people would stop respecting me. I wouldn't be somebody that other people looked up to and so on, okay? Now, if it turns out that you can't be happy unless you're respected by other people, would not the genie know that, right? The genie is all-powerful, all-knowing, right? And so the genie could not, by definition, make you happy unless made you somebody who was self-respected, okay? But my student told me, but the genie might change that aspect of me, right? It might make me one of those people who doesn't want self-respect anymore. Self-respect is no longer a constraining condition for me to be happy, and so it might change my identity, right? So there's two kinds of fears hidden in that response. So one of them is the fear of the genie, right? There's a certain distrust. I mentioned this early on in this talk, that when I ask the genie question, I've run many variants of it, and one of the variants I tell the people making the wishes, imagine that the genie is totally benign, right? And doesn't have anything but your good interests at heart. Okay, despite that, people come up with this response of distrust. Okay, there's also a fear of losing identity, right? A fear of changing into somebody that I don't recognize anymore, okay? There's interesting work by this guy called Jason Rees in Harvard, who looks at what kinds of pills are people willing to take, right? Pills that change their moods, pills that change their intelligence levels, pills that change their ability to interact with other people. So it turns out the deeper and deeper the changes are to what people think are my kind of core part of my identity, the less willing people are to take those kinds of drugs, okay? So there's some fear that we're going to change into something we don't even recognize, right? That's underlying it. Now, there's this economist at Canada called James Helliwell who does work on trust. And it turns out trust is a very, very important aspect of happiness. In fact, if you look at country-level happiness, the single biggest indicator of how happy a whole country is how the people respond to a question. On average, I can trust the people with whom I interact on a regular basis. If a lot of people strongly agree with that statement, that country is going to be happy. Okay, and it makes sense, right? If you can't even kind of relax when you're interacting with people, especially business relationships, then how happy are you going to be? You're going to be constantly vigilant, you're going to be insecure, you're going to be stressed out when you go to sleep, you're not going to be sure if things are going to work out, et cetera, okay? So trust is very important. And that is, of course, true when you look at interpersonal trust with people, dealings with people. But I'm making the case that a general sense of trust about the universe is very important as well. If you think that you're in a good place, you're taken care of, you're generally going to be nurtured and treated well, and everything that happens to you is for the best, and everything is cooperating in order to make you the best you can be. If you have that attitude, then you're going to go into life and embrace everything that happens to you with a sense of trust and a sense of peacefulness about it, okay? Emotional equanimity. On the other hand, if you think that life is a dangerous place, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, everybody's looking out for themselves, I can't really trust people, I got to be vigilant all the time, then that's going to erode into your sense of happiness. You're not going to have that same level of ease when you operate. And the fact is, whether the universe is benign or malign, there's no right answer to it, okay? The mindset that you have is going to be confirmed because of placebo effects. So if you go and operate in the world as if the world is a benign place, you're going to see evidence for it. If you're going to operate in the world as if it's a malign place, you're going to see evidence for it. If most smart people think that the world is indifferent, you're going to see evidence for that as well, okay? So this is one of those things where scientifically there's no one right or one wrong answer, okay? The answer that, the mindset that you adopt, in fact, will turn out to be the right one, okay? And I think, leaving science aside, being focused on this goal of happiness, it turns out that there's only one right answer, which is that you assume that the world is a benign place, if you can afford to do it, okay? All right, so let me spend a couple of minutes on the real reason why people don't ask the genie for happiness. So I call this the 13th monkey. And the reason I call it a monkey is because all the 12 reasons are monkeys on your back. Okay? The more you get rid of, the more monkeys you get rid of, the more you're going to free yourself into being a happy person. This, I think, is the real reason why people don't ask the genie for happiness. All the other reasons are all BS, you know? They just forgot to ask for happiness, and so they then come up with reasons for it. The 13th reason is it doesn't occur to people that they could have asked for happiness. Okay, and I know this because if I prompt people that they can ask for happiness too, right? Then suddenly, from about 5% to 45% of the people have happiness on their list. Okay? So merely mentioning, and this is what I was talking about earlier too, that this group seems to have asked for happiness, 2 times as many people asked for happiness in this group. I think it's partly because you knew what the title was, right, of the talk and so on. And this, though, is not a trivial reason. It points to this fundamental happiness paradox. And the paradox is that people think happiness is very important. It's one of their most important goals, one of the desired states to be in, but they end up forgetting that. And therefore, they end up making decisions that don't maximize their happiness. They give up opportunities to maximize happiness. Okay, let me just quickly go through a couple of scenarios, okay? I'm going to quickly read this or kind of paraphrase it. Imagine that you go into a salad bar where you pay by the pound. Imagine that everybody's been to these kinds of situations. And imagine that you really, really love a certain ingredient. Let's say chickpeas. You love chickpeas. You hate grilled chicken, let's say, okay? Now, you know that you're going to have to pay by the pound, and you know that grilled chicken is more expensive than chickpeas, right? So what are you going to do, okay? It turns out 100% of the people agree that from the point of view of maximizing your happiness, maximizing your enjoyment, you should put more chickpeas onto your plate than grilled chicken, okay? But in fact, only about 74% of the people actually do it, okay? So a good 24% are willing to sacrifice their happiness in order for enhancing value for money, okay? Here's another example, okay? Happy or right? I have to kind of qualify this by saying that this actually did not happen in my family, although it might look like it did. Okay, supposing you're in a really satisfying romantic relationship, the only thing is that, let's say that your partner is a little bit overweight, you tell them, okay, do this, X, Y, and Z, it's going to really work for you. They never do it. And then they come home running one day, very excited, saying, I just met this really handsome-looking guy at the gym, and he told me to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to start doing it from now on, So do you say, pat her on the back and say, congratulations, that's great. I'm happy that you're going to do this. I think it's going to really work. Or are you going to angrily point out to the person and say that, but that's the same thing that I told you, and you never listen to me, and now some other guy comes and tells you, and now you're all like excited, So from the perspective of maximizing happiness, it's a no-brainer, right? You eat your ego, You can either be happy or right sometimes in relationships, right? Would you rather be happy or would you rather be, well, it's not even right. It's just, would you rather boost your ego or massage your, whatever, So here again, we found a similar pattern. I mean, only about 94% of the people thought that congratulating the partner is the happiness maximizing way to go, but only about 68% were able to bring themselves to do it, okay? So I think it's because of this fundamental happiness paradox. We know that this is important, but in our day-to-day decision-making, we forget it. And therefore, we decline opportunities to maximize our happiness, okay? And having the clarity that happiness is important, both in the Gini question, as well as in everyday decision-making, is going to be a very important thing to do if you want to be happy. And I think this is a very basic internal obstacle. Before we talk about all the other recommendations, spend money wisely, socialize, set your priorities right or whatever, recognizing that there are internal obstacles that are stopping you from being happy, that are caging you in, is the first step, I feel, okay? Now, why does the fundamental happiness paradox exist? There's a very deep set of reasons that I want to talk about in the book. I'll very briefly mention it here. I think we're conditioned by society to follow certain rules of living, I call them. So we pay a lot of attention to being important, fame, money, power, etc. We lose sight of what's intrinsically motivating, what's absorbing to us. So we chase the things that are mediums to happiness rather than happiness itself. We want to be loved and attended to Rarely do we focus on loving other people and being compassionate. Now, that's one of the world's best kept secrets, I feel. When you love other people, when you're outwardly focused, chances are you're more likely to be happy. We have a very great desire for external control, controlling other people, changing other people. If we take the responsibility to change ourselves internally and take personal responsibility for our own emotional state of happiness, regardless of what happens outside of me, I know I can interpret it in such a way that minimizes my negativity, maximizes my positivity. Taking that personal responsibility is important. And finally, this is something that happens only among humans, I think, especially smart people. There's a very heavy desire for clarity on issues, especially when it comes to really complicated issues, such as, is pro-life or pro-choice the right way to think about things. You would think that for simple issues, you should have a lot of confidence. And people do have a lot of confidence. There's overconfidence almost on any issue. But overconfidence is particularly pronounced for really complex issues, okay? People know exactly what's the right thing when it comes to questions like, is there a God or not, okay? And what that God is, whether pro-choice or pro-life is good, and so on, okay? The more complex an issue gets, the more confident people get, okay? So it's because of the desire for clarity. And I think that if you give up that desire and acknowledge that some things are complicated, maybe for some things there's no answers, so what, right? Being comfortable with that ambiguity is going to be very important. And I think that ambiguity will lead to learning. And so focusing on the learning and not getting too wedded to the idea of I need to be clear on issues, I think is a very important step as well, okay? So this is my last slide. So to me, it seems like a lot of the biggest obstacles to happiness are internal. Of course, external cooperation is important. Until you reach a certain level of success, until you've sampled a certain level of fame, a certain level of wealth, you can continue to believe that maybe if I got more of those, I'm going to be happier, right? So this message is not for the poor farmer in India, for example, who thinks that driving a Mercedes or whatever is going to make them happy. They've never had the opportunity to test drive that hypothesis, right? But we have, and we know that it hasn't made us as happy as we thought it was going to make us. We continue to be more miserable, less happy than we wanted to be. And for us, I think it's important to take that perspective that I'm going to take that responsibility on myself to be the giving person, to be the larger person. And to me, the idea that, to think that this is going to be solvable easily or that, I'm going to arrive at this recommendation and then all I have to do is kind of apply this algorithm and it's going to work out. At least for me, it's not been the case. It's been a lifelong journey, and the more I've made peace with the idea that I'll never arrive at a answer, and the answer might change, keep changing, but there are some basics that seem to point me in the right direction, I think is going to be important as well. I think what you will find, as I have found, if you're similar to me, is that a very important aspect is changing the rules of living. I talked very briefly about it, happy to elaborate on it. And I think entertaining spiritual ideas is going to be a very important thing as well, especially for a lot of smart people. They get wedded to the idea that there's a certain right way to look at things, certain wrong way to look at things. And we tend to have a disparaging, derogatory kind of attitude towards people who are religious. And I think that that's a mistake. Because to be open-minded to all approaches is going to be a very critical aspect of it. And entertaining ideas such as the universe in which we live is a benign one. And entertaining ideas such as maybe there's a state of being where the mind is no longer involved. You transcend the space of the mind into a space of no mind. Entertaining these ideas, I think, is going to be a very important thing. Okay? Thank you very much.